welcome to Peter Presents Iliad. This is the very starting episode of this new live stream series, so if you're here joining me, I just want to say welcome for spending the copious free time that has become subjugated to all of us at this time here with me. Now, before we actually begin, I need to say that although I was introduced to Greek mythology at a very young age, this show is not meant to be appropriate for children. There will be a lot of bloody graphic violence because Iliad is perhaps one of the most violent books I have ever read. And it also will be dealing with a lot of adult themes, some of which will be talked about in a graphic way that perhaps is not appropriate for children. So that's your forewarning, but as long as you understand that, welcome, and let's begin. So what is this show really? Well, first off, we are meeting twice a week, or this show is airing twice a week, Mondays and Thursday evenings at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And what we're going to be doing is not an audiobook. This is not just going to be reading Iliad. Yes, I am going to be reading through the entirety of Homer's Iliad in the course of this series. However, in addition to that, there will be analysis, commentary, there will be some setup, there will be some context provided, and we'll be going through Greek mythology, as well as some of the possible history around this work, and also how we even got this text and why it's so important to begin with, because Iliad is actually my favorite book. So, trust me when I say that if I have not immediately opened this and started reading it to you straight at once, there's a very good reason for that. Because, in fact, you may have seen that this is episode 0. Because we're not actually going to start reading Iliad tonight. Now, before you get too disappointed, remember I said there's got to be a really good reason why I'm not. And I want to put your mind at ease that this isn't just going to be a lot of boring exposition that you have to get through, and that this is a book that has to be explained to you all the way in order for you to enjoy it, because that's not what's going on here. As I said, this show is presenting Iliad, and this is my favorite book. And the reason why this is able to be my favorite book is because I'm reading it in context. If you don't know about Greek mythology, if you don't understand what this story really is, then you're not going to get as much enjoyment out of it, because it was never meant to be a single self-contained story. This book is the ancient world's version of Avengers Infinity War. Now, if you haven't seen the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies like Avengers and Iron Man and Captain America and Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, then don't worry, because I'm not going to spoil those. In fact, I'm not going to spoil Iliad either. Even though it's been around for 2,600 years, I'm not going to spoil it. And some of you might think, well, how could you possibly spoil Iliad? Everybody knows that story. Well, not from my experience. In fact, before I read this book when I was in high school, I didn't know what it was about. I had heard the story, but when I read it, I was really surprised by a lot of things about the entire thing. So I would encourage you to, unless you are very familiar with this story, just hold on through this episode, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to get us ready to take on Iliad as much as we need in order to get through the first reading, because every episode is going to be less than an hour long, and every episode is going to have a little intro in it to help you get through that reading. And like I said, this was never meant to be a standalone work. In fact, some of you might know that there is a sequel to Iliad, which is called Odyssey. But before that, there was something called the epic cycle. And the epic cycle was a collection of epic poems which included Iliad and Odyssey, which were all part of the same grand, massive narrative. Now, in a perfect world, I would just start with the first poem in that epic cycle. But it doesn't exist anymore. In fact, the only two epic poems we have that are really from the epic cycle are Iliad and Odyssey. The rest have been lost to time. They don't exist anymore. But we know what happens in them because they were so massively popular that other ancient sources, like some people wrote plays based on them, or there's art depicting different scenes, and we've been able to piece together exactly what the outline or what the story is that leads up to Iliad. Now, let me first say also that I am not a professor. I am not a Homeric scholar. Well, I didn't go to school for this. I just love this stuff, and this is my favorite book, and I've got a couple. So, that being the case, it's we've got to start the story before we begin the book. And so you are going to get a story tonight. This isn't just a lot of exposition. This is actually the story. The story starts before the book because the book begins 9 years into the Trojan War. And there's a lot that happens before that. And like I said, I would love to do the entire epic cycle, but it doesn't exist. So I'm going to get us up to speed in just this one episode. In one episode, I'm going to get you right up to speed. And if you don't know anything about Greek mythology, don't worry, because you are going to get the rundown for what you need for this story. So, with that being said, let's get into it. So I'm going to set the mood a bit before we really begin the story. I just want to give some context to why this is such a big deal of a book. Why for so long it was the closest thing that a lot of people had to a Bible. And why Alexander the Great carried a copy of Iliad with him on his campaigns in a golden box. And reportedly, he slept with a knife under his pillow and a copy of Iliad, which I can only imagine was that if the knife failed on any would-be assassin, he would want to spend his last moments reading his favorite book, which is Iliad. So, think of that. Now, the Battle of Troy is supposed to have happened in about 1100 or 1200 BC. That's a really long time ago. It's a miracle that we have this story at all. And I'm going to be speaking about all these things like I would if I was talking about a movie I loved. I'm going to speak as though this is true. I'm going to speak as though this happened, like the characters and the gods are real. And I'm also going to be speaking in a way that assumes that there may be things in this story that are made a certain way to have meaning. So I'll be getting into the symbolic nature of some of the things and the parallels we find in this story with other Greek mythologies. So think now. I want you to imagine it's 2,600 years in the future from now. And imagine that we're going to talk about the Marvel movies for a second. Even if you haven't seen them, you've seen pictures of them everywhere. You're aware of them. You are aware of Captain America. You're aware of Spider-Man and Iron Man, and perhaps you're a big fan of the MCU. All right, imagine 2,600 years from now if all we had of the Marvel Cinematic Universe were the movies Avengers Infinity War and Spider-Man Far From Home. Just those two movies. Imagine that's all we had of this massive, there's like 20 movies in the MCU, there's dozens and dozens of characters, and it was spread out over like 10 years or something. I remember when it started. So imagine thousands of years in the future, we've only got those two movies. Now, Avengers Infinity War would be a great movie even if you didn't have all the context, but you wouldn't really enjoy that huge movie with all these characters, all these other movies built up to, if you didn't have all these other films to support it. If you don't know who Tony Stark is, if you don't know who Captain America is, and you don't know like what Wakanda is, then who's fighting and where are they really fighting for? Is it just because they've got cool costumes and stuff? What's it about? What's it really about? And what is Iliad really about? So imagine if there were only those two movies, Avengers Infinity War and Spider-Man Far From Home. The rest of the MCU doesn't exist, but through YouTube reviews and posters and maybe even a rare movie trailer, we know what happened leading up to Infinity War. We had an outline. And what if, in this imagined future, which may be possible, what if there's a little boy or little girl who wonders, the same way that many of us wonder, if Captain America might have been a real person? Now that sounds silly. It sounds silly to us, but think about it. If in his story, Captain America fought in World War II, well, we know World War II happened, so maybe there was a really powerful, strong, like a really fantastic American soldier, and maybe he led some men on missions, and he was the rank of captain, and maybe he got the nickname Captain America. It turned into some propaganda, and then maybe comic books and other things in these movies happened, and they gave him powers and touched up his costume, and maybe they made him larger than life. But maybe Captain America was based on a real person. People might wonder that someday. In the same way that we might wonder if Peleus' son, godlike Achilles, was a real soldier at the Battle of Troy. Iliad is for the ancient world what for many people today is the Avengers or Star Wars. Something that happened after Iliad was created was the Battle of Thermopylae, which I'll get into some other time, but it's a pretty well-known story about 300 Spartans who are terrifically powerful warriors, and there were other Greeks with them. I say that it is laughably impossible that those 300 men did not grow up pretending to be Achilles. I think it's impossible that because they knew the story. So perhaps they fought against each other, pretending they were Achilles, the same way that two brothers might fight with lightsabers, pretending that they are Luke Skywalker. The name Achilles, I hope, will last forever. It's lasted this long. And other names like Odysseus, Agamemnon, Ajax, and Hector. I wonder if Luke Skywalker and Captain America and Iron Man and many of the characters that we have today will last as long. I hope they do, but who knows? So that is the mindset and context I want you to kind of have with this story. Everybody knows this story. It uses an entire religion and the identity of a people as its backdrop. So, what is it about? What is it really about? Is it just a religious text? I don't think so, because there are other religious texts that are way more religious than this one. Is it just a war story? It is a war story. And on the one hand, perhaps it glorifies war, and perhaps it's more harrowing than Saving Private Ryan at times. So, the one thing I will say is that there are veterans who meet and they will read Homer together. They will read Iliad and Odyssey. And the general consensus that I have heard personally from war veterans who have studied Homer is that Homer gets it. He gets it. He understands war. He understands what it means to be on a battlefield, to lead men, to have a superior officer you don't like, to have a battle brother, to be on the field. And he understands the monotony of war. And in the same way, Odyssey is a story about a veteran who's just trying to get home. And there are veterans who have spoken about how Odyssey has themes in it that they identify with. It's about a man trying to get home. And it shows just how hard that can be, and all these interesting scenarios. And sometimes it can be hard to come home in a more than literal sense. And so I think it's possible that Homer was a veteran. Not necessarily, but it's possible. And I think, though, it is impossible that Homer did not see some really messed up stuff in his life, because there are things he writes about that can only be described by someone who has either had experience with it or who has listened very carefully to people who have, which is possible, but who knows? Who knows, after all. So we're going to begin this story, and it's going to be a fairly short episode tonight. And then our next episode is going to be this Thursday at 7:30 Eastern Daylight Time. And these videos are going to be staying up. And if you have any questions, leave a comment, and I'll see about getting to it at the beginning or end of next episode. So, let's begin. Ancient Greece. It's a land, but not a civilization. There are many city-states, almost tribes of people who share the same gods and goddesses, although they favor different ones, and they share the same language. But their cultures can be shockingly different, to the point where war between them is not unheard of. Now, across the sea, not too far to sail away, is another land, and there are other people with slight differences from the Greeks, although they share the same language, they share the same gods and goddesses, and some of the same customs. This land, for now, we will call Troy. And there is a city of Troy. Troy has allies, and there are other cities around, and villages and strongholds. And in fact, a lot of the trade from the far east comes through Troy and makes its way to Greece. It is a very strong civilization. One of these will be known as the birth of so many things, a lot of arts, democracy, and all kinds of stuff. And one will be known for one thing for the rest of time, perhaps. And we'll get to that later. But now that we've introduced these two, I don't want to call them nations, because the Greeks are not united, but we'll say peoples. These two peoples with a sea dividing them, but not a religion. Let us climb Mount Olympus, the home of the gods, the Olympians. And on this mountain is a wedding. Zeus, the king of the gods, the leader of the Olympians, who has mastered the thunderbolt, is there, as well as many other gods. Bright-eyed Athena, Hera, Zeus's wife, who is the goddess of marriage, who also presides over some wisdom, although Athena is the goddess of wisdom. And you have Artemis and Apollo and Hephaestus, and we'll get to a lot of these people later. In fact, I'm bringing up a lot of names, and I have found that visual aids tend to help. So, I have built this. Now, if you look on your screen, there are some statues and names, and I'll take you through some of them this evening. But we're not going to get to all of them, but we'll see how it goes. So, there is a wedding on Mount Olympus, and it's full of gods and goddesses, and in their midst is one mortal man, Peleus. And Peleus is favored by the gods, so much so that he has been allowed to marry Thetis, an immortal. And in fact, this is their wedding, surrounded by the gods and goddesses. And you've got wisdom, you have marriage, you have wine, you have all these good things that you want at a marriage. But there is one goddess who is not there, for she did not merit an invitation. Eris, goddess of discord. And why would you invite discord to your wedding? After all, you want good things there. You want to ignore the possibility of discord, but Eris shows us that ignoring discord rather than facing her can lead to incalculable destruction. So, Eris fashions a golden apple, and upon the side of which she writes the very simple, terrible word, Callisti, which means, for the fairest of all. She wings and flies her way up to Mount Olympus, and she hurls the golden apple into the middle of the wedding. It dings on the floor, and before the reverberations cease, she flies away. But she has left her gift of discord, the apple that says Callisti on it. Before the apple can barely begin to glint from the glory of the gods, it is picked up by Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, wisdom, and sexual desire. She takes the apple, shines it on her naked shoulder, and says, I am the goddess of beauty, after all. And then it is snatched from her hand by a jealous Hera. Hera is the wife of Zeus, goddess of marriage, and some wisdom as well. Perhaps she is jealous. After all, Zeus did pick her as his wife because he thought she was the most beautiful, although I think that might have been before Aphrodite showed up. And Hera takes it from her and says, oh, what a silly mistake you've made. After all, Eris is my daughter. Clearly she was throwing the apple to me as a gift for her dear mother. And let's be honest, none can surpass me in beauty, especially if we count the beauty of the mind. For, pretty little thing, there is beauty to be found in experience and knowledge and wisdom, after all. Aphrodite says, yes, I'm sure it's because of your beauty that Zeus has remained so faithful to you, Hera. And before Hera can even smack her across the face for that comment, the apple is snatched from her hand by bright-eyed Pallas Athena, goddess of wisdom, war, and handicraft, one of my personal favorites. She holds the golden apple away from them and says, well, if beauty of the mind holds any weight, I, as goddess of wisdom, clearly outclass the both of you. In fact, I am not without beauty, which, for my measurement, is beyond yours. Thus, these three goddesses got into a quite petty dispute with trading insults and getting quite mean. I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't start pulling each other's hair. and they're getting mean and they're arguing about which one of them is the most beautiful. And of course they can't agree because they are all arguing for themselves. And I just want to take a moment here to point out how selfish this is. They are arguing which one of them is the most beautiful during another woman's wedding. I mean, wouldn't the polite thing to do be to take the golden apple and immediately give it to Thetis and say, "You look so beautiful on your wedding day, darling"? Or what I would have done if I was there, let me tell you what I would have done. I would have taken that golden apple and I would have given it secretly to Peleus so that he could give it to his brand new wife as a wedding gift. That's a pro gamer move right there. It's what I would have done, and if they had done what I would have done, then this whole story wouldn't... Anyway, moving right along. So, these three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, are fighting over who is the fairest of them all, and what does fair really mean? And after all, my cheekbones and hair and... Anyway, until finally they decide to take the matter to Zeus, king of Olympus, and they tell him to tell them which of us is the fairest of all. Now, Zeus looks at Hera, his wife, and then he looks at Athena, his daughter, and then he looks at Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty, who is clearly the most lovely and the fairest. Zeus does the smart thing for once in his life and says, "I may not be the god of wisdom, but I'm not always stupid. I am not going to take any part in this contest. You go ask somebody else. I'm gonna stay right out of trouble with this one." But they pressed him and they pressed him for an answer until finally he said, "All right, I will not judge this, but I will give you someone who can. What's that boy's name? Paris of Troy. He's a prince, I think, and he is a great judge of beauty. So go ask him. As for me, I will stay right out of it." Hera makes a rather inappropriate remark about, well, yes, of course, now, beloved husband, you're going to stay out of something. And before he can retort and get into that huge fight again, the three goddesses dive down from Mount Olympus, down to Gaia, Mother Earth, and they find Paris of Troy, a prince in those days, in his land, tending some sheep, although he is a prince, for he is not the elder brother, he is the younger, and thus his father, who is king, his kingdom will not pass to his younger son. Paris, however, is fairly young and whiling away the hours with a total lack of responsibility, barely paying attention to the sheep that he has, when suddenly the three goddesses appear in their full splendor, trying to make a really strong first impression to show that they are truly the fairest of them all. They're really taking this beauty pageant seriously, and he is amazed at first. But then they show him the golden apple, and they demand that he tell them which is the fairest amongst them, after all. Now, Paris was used to women competing for his affection, and by showing their looks and doing other such things, and so he did not have to take long to think about how he could manipulate these women. For then he said, "Wow, the three of you are really something, but since my opinion is so valuable, what will you give me if I name you or you the winner of this contest?" Hera was the first to speak. Catching his drift, she says, "Prince of Troy, if you name me the winner in this grand contest, then I shall give to you the lands east and west of your father's city under your domain." This is quite impressive, because what she basically meant was, you will rule over Europe and Asia. That's a lot just to for a golden apple, right? But next to speak was Pallas Athena, bright-eyed Athena, owl-eyed Athena, gray-eyed Athena, goddess of wisdom, war, and handicraft, who said, "Oh, Hera, it is so inspiring that in your old age you are doing absolutely everything you can to win. But, Prince of Troy, if you name me the winner in this contest, then not only would you be able to hold the lands that Hera has promised you, but more than that. For I will give you victory in battle and wisdom beyond compare and mastery of all sorts of crafts, so that with those powers you will be able to conquer whatever you like with no limit." Thus Athena one-upped the wife of Zeus, Hera, goddess of marriage and also in part goddess of wisdom. But Athena really showed who was the real goddess of wisdom in that little comment, I think. Last was Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and sexual desire. And for one brief, terrible, unfortunate moment, this goddess here outsmarted the goddess of wisdom. For she knew Paris better than, well, she looked Paris up and down, and she said, "Prince of Troy, if you pick me in this small thing, then I will simply make sure that the most beautiful woman in the world is your wife." I imagine that Paris of Troy took about 3 seconds to think about this, and then he made a decision that would define him for a long time. He chose something that had nothing to do with wisdom. You've got 2 goddesses of wisdom and one more, and he threw wisdom out forever. And he said, "I wish that I could just cut up this apple into 3 pieces and give one to each of you, but if I have to pick one, it's gotta be Aphrodite. Sorry, ladies, you did a real good job. You're not bad looking, but she is the goddess of beauty after all. What can I say? What can I say?" Thus, Athena and Hera hated Aphrodite. Not for the first and last time would we see perhaps some women, girls, ladies banding together to hate another whose beauty they were jealous of. And the 2 of them felt that Aphrodite had cheated. She had bribed him, even though they were going to do that as well. And they threw out the possibility that as the goddess of beauty, maybe she would have won in a fair contest, a contest that they volunteered themselves into. But no. Aphrodite was in the wrong. They hated her forever, and they also hated that stupid Prince Paris and all the Trojans after that point. Just all of them. So Athena and Hera went away in a fury, and Aphrodite stayed behind with Prince Paris to tell him that someday soon he would meet the most beautiful woman in the world, and she would make her his wife. Some time passed. Then Paris found himself with his brother Hector, who was going to be the heir of Troy someday. Hector and Paris, for some political reason, went to Sparta in Greece. Yes, those famous Spartans are in this story, tough and brave in battle. Hector and Paris were amazed when they first saw the city of Sparta. It had no walls, and Troy was known for its huge, massive, unparalleled, impenetrable walls. But King Menelaus of Sparta explained to them how they needed no wall. In fact, they preferred to not have a wall around their city, for the Spartans believed that the people inside were more likely to fight harder if they did not have to rely on the safety of a wall. The Spartans were a very military-oriented people, and Menelaus was a strong man and a gracious host, and whatever purpose that the two princes of Troy had in Sparta went well, and they were able to make peace or an arrangement of trade or whatever it was. It's perhaps not that important. What is important is that when Paris and Hector were in Sparta, they did meet Menelaus, son of Atreus. But they also met Helen of Sparta, his wife, who was the most beautiful woman in the world. Now, this was something Paris was not too excited about at first. He felt cheated by Aphrodite. He's like, she's married? You didn't tell me the most beautiful woman in the world was taken. Aphrodite says, yeah, that's her. And he's like, but she's a Spartan. Her husband's the king of Sparta. The Spartans are the meanest people in the world. And what were you thinking? And she's like, what were you thinking? And he's like, I was thinking this would be a good idea. And she's like, don't worry. Which may or may not be good advice. So, what happens next? Well, Paris thinks how is this queen of Sparta going to become his wife after all? But it turns out that Helen liked the looks of this young prince from Troy, this foreigner, and from across the sea, from a strong kingdom. And perhaps she and Menelaus, son of Atreus, were having a fight that week. Perhaps they were in a loveless marriage. Perhaps she was just unfaithful. Perhaps it was a passionate fling. Perhaps Paris seduced her. There is a version of this story that says Aphrodite gave Paris the golden apple to give to Helen, who, when she took it, became enchanted in some way. I think that is Helen's side of the story, which we will learn more about Helen later, because you will see she is perhaps a more interesting character than just someone who's had a spell cast over her. The reason why I brought it up is because it really shows that for Aphrodite, it was never about the golden apple. It was never about that. She's a goddess. All of them were goddesses. They could have made a golden apple. She wanted to beat Athena and Hera. And those are two heavyweights in the Greek, lineup of gods and goddesses. Wife of Zeus, leader of war and wisdom, and perhaps those other goddesses looked down on her and thought her petty, and she just wanted to grind their noses into it. But whatever the case, for whatever reason, Helen of Sparta was whisked away, kidnapped, taken, went willingly, perhaps, with Paris of Troy and Hector. And so she was whisked across the sea. But when Menelaus, son of Atreus, king of Sparta, found out, of course, he was enraged. When he found out that this boy had taken his wife, really, after a pretense of peace and diplomacy. So there was a problem, though, beyond this, because Menelaus, while the Spartans were strong and great warriors, Troy was a stronger city, and the Spartans alone could not hope to break down those massive walls. But here's something else, perhaps more interesting. Menelaus is known as son of Atreus, as you will see up there. But there is another son of Atreus, Agamemnon. You see, Menelaus was the younger brother of Agamemnon. Menelaus was only king of Sparta because Helen was the rightful heir to Sparta. And so without her, he might not be able to make a claim as king. Now, of course, he's worried about losing his power, but perhaps everything we know about this guy is that he's responsible. And he did lose his wife, but whatever. It happens to the best men sometimes. But anyway, he seems like a responsible guy. Perhaps he cares about his people. He knows that if another king were to come to Sparta and challenge his claim, perhaps that would create unrest and civil war, and then there'd be more alliances between the different Greek city-states, and then more death and warfare, and he wants to avoid that, perhaps. So he goes to his big brother, King Agamemnon, son of Atreus, the king of Mycenae. That's Agamemnon, king of Mycenae. Now, quick break here for a second. Mycenae. Some people call it Mechanae. Some people call it Mycia. Some people call it... I'm going to call it Mycenae. I've looked up and seen several different experts say several different things. I've looked up different pronunciations, and as far as I can tell, there's more than one right way to say it. So if you know the answer in your heart of hearts what it is, and I'm saying it wrong, I just want you to know that I care about these things. And that I hope you will forgive me if I don't know how a word that came about in like 1200 BC was said, especially when I looked and so many different people had ideas about it. So we're going to say Mycenae. I might accidentally say Mechanae at some point. And people from Mycenae are called Messenians. So Menelaus, son of Atreus, goes to King Agamemnon, son of Atreus, king of Mycenae. Agamemnon recognizes the situation, cannot believe that his brother's wife has been stolen away by a prince across the sea. How ridiculous. But he also understands something else, which is that if Helen marries Paris of Troy, Paris may return to Greece, and he may return to Sparta, and he may try to lay a claim into Sparta as its king, with Helen at his side, if he has truly seduced her. And so that could cause all kinds of problems. The Trojans coming across the sea, perhaps their culture would grow and obliterate the Greeks. We already see how deceptive they are, and maybe they'd be absorbed. Whatever would happen. So Agamemnon realizes this, and he uses this and the cry to rescue Helen from Troy. That's the main reason they give, is to rescue Helen. And so they form a coalition of the Greeks. Many kings come for this cause, to sail across the sea to fight Troy. What kings there were. For these were not just fighters. These were not just ordinary soldiers. No, like I said, there were different city-states or tribes or whatever. These were kings that all came together to fight under the leadership of Agamemnon. Agamemnon united Greece for this fight against the Trojans across the sea. This is huge. This is monumental. And who were these other kings? Well, there was Odysseus, who was smarter and wiser and more cunning. The guy was a genius beyond compare. But he didn't want to fight. He was not an adventurer. He did not like fighting. And so he feigned madness and would plow all day, pretending that he'd lost his mind so that they wouldn't make him go to war. And the other Greeks came to him, and they thought he might be mad, but they wanted to test him. And Odysseus, trying to get out of fighting, he wants to stay with his wife, Penelope, and his children, and his home. And the other Greeks take his infant son, a newborn, and place him in front of the plow that Odysseus is pushing through. And right before the plow reaches his infant son, he stops. And he will not run over his boy. And then the other Greeks knew that he was not mad, he was faking it. And so Odysseus had to go to war and leave his family and his dear wife, Penelope, who is perhaps more legendary in some minds than even Helen. But that's another story. Continuing on to another story, another king. We have, of course, Ajax, a giant of a man. We have Diomedes, but the greatest of them all is Achilles, son of Peleus. Godlike Achilles, the greatest warrior of them all. Everyone knows that even Hector, across the sea at Troy, is no match for Achilles and his Myrmidons. Achilles' Myrmidons, they were absolute commando badasses of the ancient world. They were the special forces. They had black ships with black sails. They were all brilliant fighters. They had been trained by Achilles himself, and they would fight with him in battle. But how did Achilles come to be so great? Why is this guy so important? Is he just a great fighter? Well, he is a great fighter. And he is not known too well for his brains. In fact, he's almost a brute of a man. He is ruled by his emotions, unlike Odysseus, the genius. And Achilles has a rage about him. He has quite a temper. Because there have never been any consequences for him. Because of his mother, Thetis. Yes, we're bringing it full circle, right? Back to that wedding at Mount Olympus with Peleus and Thetis. That's right. Peleus' son, Thetis' son, Achilles. That wedding at the beginning of this story was for the parents of Achilles. Achilles was born of an immortal woman, and his mother gave birth to him under a dark star so that his life would be shorter, but so that it would be more glorious. Then when he was an infant, she took him down. Her son, Achilles, took him as an infant down to the underworld, down to Hades. And there she held him by his heel and dipped him into the river Styx. For if that river flowed over a newborn in that way, almost like a baptism, then he would be impervious to damage. He could not be harmed in battle. But Thetis was, although an immortal, scared of the underworld. All the parties are on Olympus, not down in Hades, where the dead live. And as she holds her son under the water, she becomes afraid, and she quickly takes him up, and she brings him back. But she neglected to move her hand from his heel, which she gripped tightly, meaning that the water of the river Styx could not wash over it. And so his heel became his one weak spot. Now, when I was a young boy, and my mother told me this story when I think I was about 5 years old, I became enormously frustrated. Why didn't Thetis just hold him like that and then do that? It takes just a second. Just let the water run. You almost had it perfect, lady. Come on. You're almost there. You almost had the perfect weapon. And you let it, you messed it up. You messed it up. Well, when I was 5, I did not nearly appreciate what my mom did for me as much as I do now. And maybe someday, when you have a kid and you take them down to Hades and dip them into the river Styx while listening to the growls of Cerberus and the wailing of the dead, maybe you will remember to do that so that you make the perfect warrior. But you know what? Thetis did the best she could. She really did. And you know what? Maybe it was good enough. And maybe I'm projecting right now. So anyway, continuing on with our story, that is Achilles. He is king of Phthia, spelled Pthia, and he has his myrmidons and his black ships with their black sails, and he's young and energized and ready. Let's say he's 18, and he's the greatest warrior. And he joins the armada of over 1,000 ships. Helen's face launched 1,000 ships across the sea. They landed on the shores of Troy, ready to do battle, and do battle they did, with their spears and their chariots, with bloody axles as they run over the dead, and they fought and fought, but then they kept fighting, and they kept fighting, until they kept fighting, and a year went by. And another year went by, and still they could not break down the walls of Troy. And another year, and another, and then the monotony. The same armor, the same plain, the same walls, the same enemy, the same color of blood, the same sound of the rattling of chariot wheels, or the sound of bronze on shields, or a spear hitting through flesh or armor. The same rock on the plain, changing only when it's kicked or tripped upon or stained with blood. The same screams, the same yells, and eventually just the same stories over and over. The monotony, the boredom, the terror, the combat, the glory for the day. And so the Greeks set up a permanent residence on the shore. They built a wall around their ships and dug a trench in front of it until they had a fort on the shore across the plain from the city of Troy. And there they had a standstill, fighting in the plain. It's almost like no man's land in World War I. Neither can break the other. They just go out and fight, and then they come back and get ready to fight again. The only thing shining in the mud anymore is the armor they polish before they fight. They're tired. They're sick of it. But they're also just used to it. They have made their homes there. This war is their life. For 9 years. 9 years of waiting for glory. 9 years in the life of Achilles, who was promised a shorter life, but for more glory? Where is it? And that is where Iliad begins. 9 years into the Trojan War between these two massive peoples, a war that will perhaps define the Mediterranean and the lands beyond forever, to see who wins. Whoever wins could become the dominant power for centuries. This is Iliad. Well, I think that's about enough for tonight, and I hope you have enjoyed it. I hope that you will join me again this Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, where we will begin reading Homer's Iliad as translated by Stanley Lombardo and published by Hackett Publishing. Now, before we go, I want to say, and I will begin my next program with this as well, I have received personal permission from Stanley Lombardo to use his translation for this series. I am very grateful. This is my favorite translation. I was able to speak with him, and I'll tell you more about that story some other time. The opinions and views expressed in this program, of course, do not necessarily reflect the opinions or views or policies of Hackett Publishing or Stanley Lombardo, but I hope that if they watch this, they like it. But anyway, this has been episode 0. Tune in 2 days for episode 1 of Peter Presents Iliad. Thank you very much for your time, and have a wonderful evening. Stay safe and stay healthy. Good night.